All right. Hello there, healthcare humans. Thank you so much for coming back for another episode of The Other Human in the Room. I'm super excited to have this conversation with someone that works with folks in healthcare in a very unique way. And I had the honor of participating in one of your events at a retreat I was at, and it kind of blew my mind. And I thought, okay, there's a way I can get this guy on my podcast. I'm going to do it. And here we are. I'm so excited. So, would you introduce yourself, please?
Absolutely. My name is Hartley Jafine. I am a faculty member at McMaster University. I wear a lot of different hats. I'm in the Bachelor of Health Sciences program, the Arts and Science program, and the Department of Family Medicine, as well as undergrad med. My background is entirely in theater, specifically applied theater, so how theater can be used as a tool for development. And I eventually took a turn or found a way to combine my love of theater with healthcare and medicine. And that's the work that I do presently.
That's so cool. I am curious, how did that turn come to be? Like, did you say that I'm going to go after healthcare until they find a way to make a role for me? Or, how did that process go?
So my inspiration was when I was doing my graduate school in London. My supervisor connected me with the place called the Claude Ensemble, which is based out of Queen Mary's University of London's medical school. And Claude Ensemble has a theater company or a theater program within it called Performing Medicine. And while I was doing my graduate training, my supervisor said, "Oh, you are interested in theater and health?" Because for me, we were looking at all sorts of applications of theater in non-traditional theater spaces, looking at theater in prisons, in education. And for me, I always had a bit of an interest in looking at the intersections of theater and health. And so she said, "Oh, you need to meet Susie Wilson, who I think still is the director of the Claude Ensemble," and met them out there and saw the work that they were doing and was really inspired by it and knew I'd be moving back to Canada. I was going to be moving to Hamilton that fall, and then started kind of knocking on doors and trying to carve a space for a similar type of role here within the Hamilton and kind of Ontario space.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's such a cool, I love the idea of performing medicine. I'm really curious about that. It's something that I've thought of a lot. Like, so me practicing family medicine, um, and thinking about this conversation, one thing that reminded me of was that when I first started, certainly through medical education, so like med school, residency, sort of the whole fake it till you make it situation. And especially when I was a new grad, I consciously was like, I'm an actor. I'm playing a role. I'm not myself in a way that was like the way I could go into rooms and pretend to be a doctor that technically the degree said I was, but I was like, I don't know what I'm doing, behind the scenes. So I just think it's so interesting. I had that as a bit of like a coping strategy, but I never had no one I hadn't interacted with a space where they were talking about how, what is it like to actually think about performance and how it relates to medicine. So I was curious about that. Like, how do you find the intersections between theater and medicine? Like, what have you found to be some really interesting starting points when you're having conversations with people, whether like medical learners or people who are further into practice?
I think it's very similar to what you mentioned that,
Yeah.
medicine is a performance, and how might theater and improv be used to help enhance that performance? I think there's a lot of intersections. Part of the reason why I was drawn to theater and healthcare was because a lot of the principles that I was learning as I was doing my training, how to collaborate with someone on a stage, how to embrace spontaneity, how to listen actively and presently, how to be aware of body language in a space, things that I was learning when I was training to be an actor once upon a time. I saw a really clear application to medicine and healthcare, and was really excited by the possibilities of how that theater training could be used to enhance the performance of healthcare when working with patients or with colleagues. And for me, as I mentioned in that retreat that we met each other at, I always like to start a session with saying, we are all performers, and whenever I say that, people usually get resistant, or some people get resistant because they say, "Oh, I'm not a performer, I don't perform." And as you're describing, we perform every day of our lives. We perform as children, as parents, as friends, as siblings, our professional roles. We constantly perform role to role. And being aware of that performance, not in a false or inauthentic way, something that's authentically you, but you're still switching the role because the roles that you play shift and change depending on quote unquote what scene you're in. And
Yes.
so I think there's a lot of really nice applications to theater, to medicine from the theater world. And thinking about some of the things that I found when I was doing my training as an actor, and the big thing that we learned when we were playing characters was, what is your character fighting for? What does your character want?
Mm,
Because in theater, sometimes you're playing a character that is committing very morally or ethically questionable behavior, or really morally moral and questionable behavior. But you've got to be in your character's corner, because when you're performing them on stage, you have to support their worldview.
yeah.
And I was thinking about how when clinicians meet patients who they might not align with in terms of their perspectives, it can be very easy to dismiss that person as someone who is a quote unquote an idiot, or
Yeah.
foolish, or not not working with me. The harder job is to say, what is this person, what is this patient fighting for? And this is
Mm.
true kind of within medicine and in our everyday lives.
Yeah, I love that. I love that as like a way to frame like because a lot of times what we see and it's an accurate way to perceive it, which is they are being aggressive, they're being demanding, they're being difficult. Those are valid as well. And to say like why like this person is really coming at me. What are they fighting for? It allows you to still have your experience of like, whoa, this is a lot in the room, but then getting curious, which always helps of like, I wonder why. Even if it's like, I'm going to go take a break or we're going to have a conversation another day. But like, versus thinking that they're out to get you or that it's something personal to you, which is what can happen to a lot of people. I also think it's an interesting question to pose for ourselves, like in healthcare, like what we're fighting for, especially because I think part of the dissonance happens is when we think the role of doctor or the role of nurse practitioner or whatever, we think that we have to play the role a certain way that's really rigid. And it's not even necessarily authentic to ourselves. And especially in cases where it's also not jiving with the patient, then there's like so much dissonance in the room. And so that's what I really loved about, well, first of all, what you just said about like still having it be authentic to you, but recognizing you're showing pieces of yourself. And what you said at the retreat, which was all about improv. Because in improv, the word I love to use is like co-creation. Like that's what we're doing in the room with a patient. And improv, that's what I see. Like no one has a script memorized. So you can't be rigid. Like, no, I'm really this. Like the whole point of improv from the outside, what I've seen is that nobody actually knows what's going to happen next. And so there's no room for rigidity in it. Um, I'm curious if you've noticed that same issue where folks in healthcare can feel a little rigid and like, no, if I'm going to be a good doctor, that means I have to do it this way or I have to do it this way. And what kind of improv can bring to someone who's feeling rigid like that?
Yeah. For me, the link is with how we train physicians. And I know that that's changing and has changed over my time working in healthcare. And one of the things that I've noticed is that we take students who are really high achieving, because you need high grades in undergrad to get into medicine.
Yeah.
So these are students that are very, very skilled at either playing the education game or are really strong and skilled academics. And then you put them into a space where medical school, where there is a right answer, you're constantly being tested, and there is a high expectation, not everywhere, but kind of the stereotype is that you have to, even if it's day one, you need to know the answer. And if you don't, you're behind. And that
Mhm.
kind of culture kind of breeds a striving for perfection, which can lead to burnout and all sorts of problems within healthcare. And one of the things that one of the very first things that I did, one of the very first classes that I ever taught within a medical school context, I asked the group to walk around the room like a monkey. And within minutes, I got asked questions like, is this what you're looking for? Are we doing it right? And
Yeah.
I think that's exactly what your comment speaks to, is that that idea of being spontaneous and being free and being playful is something that is really absent in healthcare. And I recognize fully that healthcare is a very serious place because the stakes are as high as they get.
Yeah.
And as well, there needs to be space where people can play creatively. And I think part of education needs to carve out those spaces or find ways to develop educational spaces where people are free to explore and test and play with ideas, in order to improve their ability to be a clinician. So Your question was about, the value of improv and kind of pushing up against that rigidity. I think it can be really valuable, because we need that free, spontaneous exploration.
Yeah, I think, and it's very validating to hear from the outside how medical education is described, because even whether it's actually true, like certainly there's sort of some preceptors that really, if you didn't know that answer, it's like a public shaming. It's like you're like, basically, it could be put into stocks. It feels very similar emotionally. And then just a little bit of that energy means that even if the preceptor's like, I don't care, you're like, no, I need to know all the answers. Like then you start to internalize it and take it on yourself.
Yeah.
And it's such a loss because learning equals making mistakes, like learning equals play, like you say, and experimenting with different answers. And so it's just sort of, it's a tragedy that that's how it's been approached. And I'm happy to hear that it's changing. It doesn't make sense. Like you wouldn't show up on the first day of anything and then get tested on all the material. Isn't the point that you learn it along the way?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the rules that we talk about in improv, I'm not sure if I quoted it in our retreat, but one of the rules that is often cited is that there are no mistakes, only gifts. And I find that
Ooh,
in education, and I'm always careful within medicine because there are mistakes, certainly, that
yeah.
are problematic. But as a learner, especially when you're doing something for the first time, there are no mistakes, only gifts. That if you've understood the material and you are trying to apply it, or you are engaging with a conversation or a concept for the very first time and you're navigating through it, there are only gifts in that conversation. It's just about you and your learning and growing your understanding of whatever it is that you're tackling.
Yeah. I think I'm really coming to a place where that can be true even within healthcare. Not just like we can still label an error. We cut off the wrong leg. We won't be like, oh, it's like it's certainly not to
It's
the
a gift.
patient.
It's a gift.
Like, no, no, no. We would be like, oh my gosh, attend to the impact, repair, like things that you do. But like in terms of like thinking about it in our brains, like if we think of like whatever we think a mistake means, whatever we equate a mistake to meaning, which is like, I'm therefore stupid or I'm a failure. No, like, what is the gift? What is the learning? There's always learning to be had in an error that's made. And in fact, that's the only way. If we want to reduce mistakes, we do have to view the lessons we learn from mistakes as gifts. Otherwise, we're more likely to repeat them.
Absolutely. And not to go off on a bit of a tangent, but I think about how a lot of medical schools have annual musicals that they put on. U of T's
Mm,
show has been going
yes.
on since 1911. Western show has been going on since the mid 50s. And if you look historically at what those shows are about, a lot of the themes and a lot of the plots and storylines of those shows are about medical errors or a learner making a mistake and either growing from it or kind of exaggerating the impact of a preceptor yelling at them and them crying, or
Yeah.
it's using theater as a space to process that
Mm,
mistake. And that's why I think theater can be really valuable in a space. And also I theorize that the reason why the vehicle of theater is being used is because a lot of spaces aren't having those conversations in formal educational spaces. There aren't a lot of opportunities to say, I don't know that, me too. There's
yeah.
a lot of shame, I think, associated
Yes.
with not knowing.
Oh my gosh. I'm actually curious. Shame is a topic that comes up a lot on this podcast because it's like it's what makes it a hidden curriculum, like all the things. When like I guess the whole thesis of this podcast is like the things we're ashamed of are human things. So for example, humans make mistakes because sometimes we don't even know we're making a mistake. It's just like a surprise. Like we don't even know. Like humans need sleep. Humans need to enjoy things to feel sad. Like it's like basic things, but we're like shamed into thinking that we have to somehow be less human. And I also think about trying to like, well, I guess I've been doing more public speaking and that's been interesting, but like imagining really like doing improv in front of a group of people. Like at the retreat, I was like, oh my gosh, is this going to be like, whose line is it anyway? I'm not funny. I'm so scared. And it's like that shame, the shame thing, the fear of being embarrassed in front of our peers is very, very strong. It's at least for me, the main anxiety I can still feel to this day of like, oh my gosh, what do people think of me? And you've come from a profession where I mean, probably I guess actors probably have that worry as well in a different way, but like you then put yourself out there in a way where you're like, hey, my whole job is for you to think something of me in a way, like, and to have an experience with me. So what is like the theater training and world taught you about how to deal with that like embarrassment and shame and how people think of you?
Part of it is the practice, is that certainly those
Yeah.
nerves come with you. And this is, you know, I kind of slice this two ways, because part of my training when I was doing my undergrad training was about acting, less about improv. So
Right.
the way you get comfortable with it is that you learn the script and you learn the character, and then
Yeah.
you're ready to go because you've got that script and you've got the comfort of the script and you've been rehearsing it again and again, which operates slightly differently than improv, where it is pure spontaneity and ambiguity, where you've got to take what's been given to you by your partner or by the audience.
Yeah.
So from the improv world, the way you get comfortable with those eyes on you is that practice of trying and testing and developing that. I think creativity and spontaneity and ambiguity is a skill like any other, and it's one of
Mm.
those skills that if you don't use it, you lose it. And to go back, I think one of the things that I've noticed is that kind of education in general, and luckily not in the spaces that I teach in, but from what I see is that educational spaces in general don't allow for that kind of ambiguity and uncertainty. You know,
Yeah.
we love a rubric, and in my classes I don't use rubrics, and that could be very destabilizing to students because they want the rubric.
Yeah.
And I always tell my students, you can try something out and it not work out and like quote unquote fail spectacularly and still get an A plus.
Mm.
And I think that a lot of educational spaces don't have that same safety net where you can try
Yeah.
something, it be unsuccessful. Obviously, there has to be some reflecting and conversation about what did you learn? If you were to do it again, how would you do it differently to kind of demonstrate that learning? And so for me, the way you get comfortable with that improv is that constant trying. And part of that comes down to culture too, is that when you're in an improv space, generally speaking, the audience is supporting you. They want you to succeed. And your
Yeah.
peers, one of the rules is, take care and support each other. Yes, and each other. And so you know that in that space, even if you toss something out and the group is like, oh, that's not where we wanted to go, they're going to say yes, and they are going to go along that journey with you. And so having that unconditional support allows
Yeah.
you to not worry so much about the shame, because even if you throw something out there, the group is gonna be behind you to support you in any way they can.
Yes, I mean, it's literally like you've carved out a space where just the likelihood of someone shaming you is much lower because you've already sort of created a contract with each other, if you will, of being like, this is a space where we don't do that to each other. And how beautiful would that be if that was the culture in healthcare,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
Yeah. And I think little pockets are forming. I think like, and I'd be really curious, like folks who go through your courses, I don't know if like, what do you find like in terms of, I don't know, have you had a chance to like follow up with students who then maybe they're out in practice now? And what is it that they learned through experiencing this sort of safe space with you that they've been able to take into their practice?
So I find lots of different things have come through over the years. Some of it is the what are you fighting for is a really valuable conversation that they have that they've shared with me. Some of it is that awareness of the performance, as we've spoken about, being aware
Yeah.
of when they enter a space, how are they entering? What is the energy that they're bringing into that room? Being able to
Mhm.
read the other body languages of the patient or their loved ones in a space. And as well, making sure the comment that I get a lot is that I used to think that medicine and healthcare and art and creativity were two kind of separate, mutually exclusive domains.
Yeah.
And I feel students who have gone through courses with me have been exposed to and see how actually the two fields are very interconnected. And then they are trying to carry that through in their own scholarship or their own teaching or their own learning, which is really, really valuable. And one thing that I was thinking about when you said, wouldn't it be amazing if that's the culture of healthcare? I was sort of the work that I have been doing in recent years is thinking about the value of that kind of culture within healthcare, which is incredibly valuable for all the reasons why, but also in
Yeah.
terms of us non-healthcare in relation to healthcare. Because our expectations of a healthcare system is unrealistic. As you said, physicians are humans, and I
Mhm.
feel as though the general public forget that. And our expectations are, they are, physicians are infallible. They must sacrifice fully to the profession. And
Mhm.
certainly there are a lot of elements that can be true about those kind of conversations. We do expect our doctors to have knowledge, and we do expect there to be some sacrifice. But I also think that we need to recalibrate our expectations as well to support the healthcare system.
Yeah. How have those conversations been going? I've always, so I guess behind closed doors or whatever, I certainly have heard over the years amongst physicians, um, like, is anyone in the government or whoever, um, attempting to shift patient expectation as well? And so, because and this is a very yes and conversation, right? So it's like everyone, how can everyone be shifting their focus to understand the humanity of everyone else, basically, of the situation? But it's tricky because I mean, well, patients are everybody.
Yes, yeah.
And so it's an interesting thing of how does one start to like shift perception of what's realistic in healthcare? I don't, has this been an internal conversation with yourself for now or
That's it.
yeah.
I mean, I
Mhm.
haven't done any work with people outside of kind of formal healthcare roles
Yeah.
to explore this conversation. Just something that I've been thinking about. I mean, one of the things that I noticed when I first started doing this work, looking at theater and medicine, the goal initially was clinical encounters and
Yeah.
using theater and improv in that conversation, or you know colleague interprofessional teams. And when I started working more and more with medical students, with residents, with clinicians, I really started to see how burnt out, and this is not a new phenomenon by any means, but it was new to me as a learner of like, whoa, this is the conversations that people were having about their experiences in healthcare. Some of the work that we do some devised theater where we create a character. And oftentimes within applied theater, the character that you build is very representative of, I had a professor, Sylvan Baker. He's an incredible applied theater practitioner in the UK. And he taught us, you've got what you spot, and so a lot of what was
Mm,
being projected onto these characters were, conversations that the room wanted to have about their experiences as a resident or as a medical student. And I was
yeah.
looking at the characters that were being created, and I was going, wow, okay, this that's really tough
They
to
were
have
pretty
all those
scary.
layers. Pretty scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, I just love the idea of having spaces where this stuff can be expressed because as we said, like the shaming and the yeah, where it's like you don't know this, like that it has to be like a secret. We can't speak it out loud. Um, I mean, it's something that I'm personally trying to shift by saying I don't know a lot more, but things take time. Another thing I was curious if you touch on it, just because I was thinking of things that folks who listen to the podcast say that they commonly struggle with that might be relating to you. So we already talked about the fear of making mistakes. So that's and the fear of looking bad, actually. Um, I don't know how often does boundaries come up in your work? Is that something you like explore with folks? And like how does it come up?
In what context?
Yeah, I get well, if you work for the Department for Family Medicine, like with clinicians out in practice, is that a piece of what you do? It's okay if you don't, but I was just like curious if you have insights about what gets in the way of setting boundaries and if say the idea of playing a role or if there's something there that could be helpful for those that struggle with setting boundaries.
Hmm. I'd say the work doesn't formally, that's not the question I thought. Because in my head, I was thinking about the boundaries of what comes out of a session. Like, what do you do with that once you get people sharing, and then you're left
Oh,
with
yes.
the mess almost of, okay, this has been shared. Now
Yeah.
what?
Yeah.
Um, and what is my role and what are my boundaries as a facilitator of the work? In
Mm,
terms of the boundaries of the learners or the residents, um, it doesn't, sometimes it comes up when we do role play, and
yeah.
we are role playing a conversation, and it's not always role play in terms of you're a physician and this is a patient and the situation is the patient is in a lot of pain. Some of it is role play where you're a parent and a child and you're packing for a vacation,
Yeah.
and then all of a sudden you start to think about, okay, well, the child doesn't want to go on vacation. And
Yeah.
well, what is that character fighting for? But then as the parent, maybe you also don't want to go on that vacation, but how much you disclose to the child and how old is the child? And what
Mm,
do you need to share with them that might help them get on board? And what actually might you share with them that actually could really shift what they're fighting for in a way that completely changes the outcome of trying to pack to get out the door for the trip? So
yeah.
boundaries do come up, not maybe not direct. Um, the other way boundaries, maybe this is less boundaries and more, um, I see dynamics come into play in terms of
Yeah.
interprofessional dynamics. And where does one role end and another one begin?
Yeah.
And how to navigate that, or who is responsible, or who sees themselves as part of the team and who doesn't.
I think that I think a lot of times in a way that's literally saying what is the boundary, especially if someone's taken on more than they feel they have capacity for even, or that their role demands, or and someone's taken on less. And in some ways, it's interesting. It like loops back to the like, yeah, what are they fighting for conversation? Because like a lot of times when people say, oh, I'm struggling with boundaries, underneath why they're struggling with boundaries is that they have been deeply socialized to be uncomfortable with conflict. And now here comes a person who's fighting hard for something. And so it's so useful to be like, why are they fighting for it? I could see that actually being a tool in such conversations. Um, and I'm wondering what else could be helpful there, because those sorts of conversations are really challenging. Like certainly say like in the pandemic, there were certain kinds of new and very tricky conversations we were having to have, certain kinds of boundaries where depending on the patient's like political or emotional or social beliefs, they may have a different perspective on your mask policy.
Mhm.
As a family physician, vaccine conversations got really, really challenging, like especially as the ones that didn't want, they could have some really hard information in them that
Mhm.
made it easy to sort of disconnect and want to separate from, or to get resentful or have negative emotions towards your patients. And then that feels so hard and heavy. And so, yeah, I feel like it sounds like, well, when you're asking like the what are you fighting for question, that could be helpful in those situations of like even asking like why is this person fighting so hard for this, right? And I'm wondering if you explore that more, even like times of disagreement or conflict between two people. um what does role play help people work through, and are there strategies that you kind of recommend people try to see if they help bring resolution in a way that feels better?
So you've already, it's funny, you've set it up actually way back in the
Yeah.
beginning of our chat, the curiosity piece. And that kind
Mm-hmm.
of links in with the improv of yes anding. Okay, if someone's in front of you, I don't want the vaccine. Okay, tell me why. Like, kind of to deeply understand like what is going on.
Yeah.
I facilitate a session with Stacy Ritz, who's the assistant dean of the health sci program, and with our first year students. And one of the things that we do is at the beginning of the session, we have students pair up and they have to have a conversation of what's better, cats or dogs, and one person has to take cats and one person has
Yeah.
to take dogs, and we ask them to kind of argue to the death that their position is right.
Mm.
And then we do our session. At the end of the session, we ask them to do it a second time, but the second time approach from a place of curiosity and
Yeah.
ask them to compare how those two conversations look different. And that and the whole session is about how to have difficult conversations. And part of it is thinking about a lot of what we've talked about already today. What are you fighting for? The idea that perspectives could be different. One of the exercises that I've done in my theater spaces are you ask someone to take on a space anywhere in the room and kind of affix their gaze in a certain locked position. And then I take
Mm-hmm.
a bunch of items and scatter them around the space, props and toys and stuff, and I ask them, what do you see? And so some people see 5 computers, 2 mugs, and 1 hat. And some people see nothing. And some people see, and the point of the exercise is that everybody is seeing something different, but we're all in the same room. It
Yes.
just depends on kind of which way your head is fixed.
Mm.
And thinking about how that could be applied to any number of things. I mean, people who are vaccine hesitant or people who don't trust the medical system, well, there could be a lot of historical, oppression
Yes.
within the medical system that might have brought them to that space.
Yes.
So thinking about how has your or my lived experience influenced how I'm approaching this conversation? How is their lived experience approaching how they're approaching this conversation? And what biases are in play that might be unconscious or conscious in those conversations.
I love that exercise. I feel like that really illustrates perfectly like what is happening, especially in conversations. And this could happen in a like a patient context, but also just like with another human where you're like at the end of the conversation, you're like, we were definitely talking on different planets. Like it just it's we really have this delusional belief that all humans should think the same, or certainly we think that they do think the same. But I mean, you've been around enough humans, you're just like, we're all looking at different corners of the room, you
Yeah.
know? We
Yeah,
really
I
can't
mean,
see what we can't see.
I say this to, like, one of the things the play is escaping me now of what it was called. And it was a play that I saw in Toronto maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And the line that was in the play was that there is one output and several different inputs. And I tell my students this all the time of like, I am saying something and it's one output, but one of you is tired, one of you is hungry, one of you is paying really close attention, and there are 19, 20, 30 different inputs as to what I'm saying. And exactly as you're describing, even though you're all hearing the same thing, you're all in the same room, we're all in the same shared space, if you are tired, maybe you dozed off for a second and you actually didn't hear what I said. And so even though we think it's a shared experience, it really is very individualized.
Yeah. And there's the wisdom of that is both, right? So first to give the colleague or the patient at least a level of understanding of like, oh, that's probably why they're so snappy. And also, like, I know that if it's the last appointment before lunch, I have a different bandwidth than the first appointment of the morning. And I actually try and snack so that doesn't happen. But like, but like literally, like you can tell that yeah, your context and you, even just how resourced you are, like what else has just happened, you may actually literally mishear what they say, and certainly how personally you take it. Huge difference.
Yeah.
So helpful to know. Okay, the last exercise I wanted to talk about that was like the coolest exercise that we did in that improv thing was the penguin exercise. I don't know. Is this like a spoiler? Anyway, it'll still be fun if you someday do a workshop with Hartley and we do it. But I don't know that I've seen a better example of what is happening, just like as a healthcare system, as to what happened in that exercise. Would you mind just like describing it a bit and like what can happen in that exercise?
Absolutely. And it is my staple. I have started every single class, every single workshop, with the exception being the pandemic where the exercise didn't translate to virtual spaces, but it's how I start every session. And the basic premise of Penguin is that everybody who is in the room is on a chair and the chairs are scattered around the room. So there's no circle, there's no formalized chair arrangement. The chairs are scattered facing any direction that players want. The only rule is that they must be sitting in the chair. And then there's only one empty chair. And my role as Penguin is to sit down in any empty seat I can. And so I first start off waddling like a penguin towards the one empty chair that's in the room. And the responsibility of the ensemble is to stop me from sitting down. And the way the group does that is by swapping seats. And so what happens is as more people get up out of their chairs to sit in the empty chair, it leaves new empty chairs for the penguin to sit down in. And those are basically the rules. They can't physically stop Penguin in any way. And the moment they've lost physical contact with the chair, it means that they've committed. So they can't sit back down in the chair. They have to sit in another empty chair before they return to the chair that they're in. And usually it devolves into laughter and chaos, and it's a lot of fun.
Yes. Yeah, and I think it was interesting, like debriefing after how, like, so there was all different. I believe we were all physicians, or certainly all clinicians, and so we tried the first time and realized, oh, right, okay, we need to have a strategy. What's the strategy gonna be? Okay, only a few people. Like one of the strategies we tried was like, okay, only 4 people just keep switching seats. And it was incredible how many people who were not those 4 people would just get like, I've got to do something. And then like, just have to leap. And then like the chaos of like, next person. And then you'd be like, there would be an empty chair. A couple times it actually was me where I was standing, I'm like, guys, someone needs to sit in my seat and you're waddling over and everyone else is like frozen. It just was like, it's so fascinating about like human dynamics and like, and complex systems. I just thought like there's something to it, like the way that I think it's really important to like study that just to understand. Because like a common like a common saying that people say about doctors, they probably say it about all sorts of groups, but they say it about doctors for sure, is that organizing doctors is like herding cats. I don't know if you've ever heard that expression, but like
Yeah, yep.
also this penguin exercise. This is also like trying to organize doctors, trying to get people together. And yet, you know, as clinicians, we are buffeted like, okay, the government always wants us to do this one thing. And but there's this local initiative over here. And like I do some like I've done some system leadership work in the past. And there's something about that exercise that really resonated with me of like these like it's hard to have a vision, first of all, when the variables keep changing. And it would take a certain kind of culture to really stay in sync with each other. And you have to build a certain amount of trust and like, I guess, mutual understanding with each other to not have it devolve into the panic and the chaos. Have you had groups where they never devolved into panic and chaos? You know?
No, no.
Okay. It's good to know. It's good to
It always,
know.
because I've had groups where we do a really smooth job of keeping Penguin up for a long period of time.
Yeah.
But then eventually, as is true with most systems, someone makes an error, someone makes a mistake. uh,
Yes.
because they're tired or they misjudge or they think they're helping,
Yes.
and then suddenly,
Yes.
boom, it devolves into that chaos. And
Yes.
it's not always, as you said, there were four runners, and
Yeah.
we in your group we described four runners. That was it. There were about 50 people, 40, 50 people. There's going to be
Yeah.
four people running, and then someone sees me waddling and they go, okay, I don't know if that runner can make it.
Yes.
I'm gonna help.
Yes, it beautiful intentions. Like no one was being like a troll or something. Like they were like, yeah, I'm helping. And then they leave their chair, which is inevitably closer to Penguin than the chair right towards. And yeah, like a bit of it's like about intention versus impact of just like and and a bit of like I think all humans and including clinicians have this like action bias of like do something feels a
Yeah.
lot better than sitting and waiting, whether that's like do something and kind of over treat a patient or even like all the pendulums shifting as we try and sort out like what is our healthcare system actually going to become, you know? And there's some wisdom with just the sitting.
The best thing to do is just to kind of sit and do nothing, even though it's such a
Yeah.
hard thing to experience. And one of the things that, like, the groups that I've worked with that have done Penguin really, really well or skillfully are the ones that there are four runners, and then you have the people who are sitting down, and maybe this is giving away. So future Penguin players, this is kind of your hot tip, is that
Yes.
they're going to make the move to help, even though they're not one of the runners. And if you have a team that knows each other well, they will signal to somebody else, kind of saying, I'm going to run, you're going to take my seat now.
I'm
And
becoming a runner
I'm
and
gonna
you're
become a
going to
runner,
sit.
and they signal to somebody else to also become like now there's six runners for the
Yeah.
moment. And it's a
Gotcha.
way of like, I'm gonna help out, but I'm also gonna help out in a way that doesn't leave my seat unattended, that it's gonna be covered by somebody else. So they kind
Yes.
of set up the group for success, which is really hard to do because Penguin sometimes changes directions and changes speeds. So there
Yeah.
is a bit of complexity to it where it's not always consistent. And but the groups that kind of are really successful at keeping Penguin up a long time is ones that make sure that they're helping out, but they're also helping out, making sure that somebody else is going to cover them too.
I feel like that is a very potent metaphor for especially like an under-resourced healthcare system. You know what I mean? And like,
Yeah.
what if that's the best we could do? And it will mean that sometimes Penguin sits, which like it will mean actually all the time in our current healthcare system, some amount of patient care is not delivered as we hope. But just because like it's just it's not happening right now. Like, you know, lots of people don't even have family doctors. Like we're already in a state where like we're losing the game, if you will. But there's something about the game where yes, can you find a way to cover each other in a nimble way, in a way where you're not getting frustrated with each other, where you're not when you're understanding people have good intentions, like there's a lot to be learned from it. And it was so fascinating, like, oh, that's an emerge decision. And that, you know, like it was really interesting to see the different psychologies playing out. And it felt like resonant. I feel like everyone's got to do this exercise, actually.
It's my favorite. And as well, thinking about um as you experienced, I've never had a group that blames. Once Penguin sits down, everyone's like, oh, okay, let's do it
Yes.
again. And
Yes.
that is the energy that I think could really benefit groups and teams of like when Penguin sits, how do we collectively go, ha ha ha, all right, let's go at it again. And have that
Yeah.
debrief. So in those, if we use that as a metaphor for healthcare, whatever the penguin sitting down represents,
Yeah.
we collectively laugh and then kind of strategize, okay, we're going to do this again. What do we want to do differently this time? And
Yes.
it wasn't finger pointing of like, why did you get up? Can't believe you got
Yes.
up, person.
Yes.
It's much more supportive.
It is. And like that phrase, like take care and support each other, like yes, and super helpful. Take care and support each other. Super, super helpful. Like we should all get bracelets of it or something. Cause I just it's so hard because when you don't feel supported, that's when you tend to blame. That's when you tend to lash out. That's what you're like, no one's supporting me, and now it's your fault. And like it's like, like I imagine there's a version of Penguin where I don't know, like if you lose something gets taken away from you, where you add some scarcity and stakes to it, where then people would more likely to switch to blame. And it's because they feel, you know, I'm going to make fun of the person who loses Penguin or something, you wouldn't, because that would be not very nice. But like, that's the kind of elements that are kind of a part of our current system of like, you're going to be judged if you lose. And that's what makes it different from a lovely game,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know?
The only example that I can think of that aligns with that is I've played Penguin before, where every time Penguin sits, a new empty chair gets added. So it adds
Ah,
to that layer of like, okay, now
okay.
the group was unsuccessful, and now you've got a second chair to contend with. Uh, and
Yes.
though I still find that even because the exercise is so low stakes,
Yes.
it becomes this, okay, well now, oh, and then eventually there are five empty chairs, and the group is
Yeah.
really laughing because it's almost an impossible task, or the task is
Yes.
really challenging. Um,
Yes.
but you've got the buy-in where people are willing to play. I think if you started off
Yes.
the exercise where you have 10 empty chairs, I think there'd be a lot
Then
of people checked out like
forget
this
it.
is an impossible task. I'm not even going to play.
But I mean, the way you just described it, that is an even more potent metaphor for healthcare because that is what is happening is people
Right.
are leaving.
Yeah.
And one of my beliefs is we actually have to get, whether we can laugh and cry, we can grieve and we can celebrate the absurdity of trying to fill all the empty chairs because that's what our psychology is like. Well, I'll just stretch myself more, and we're already too stretched. So like saying the penguin's gonna sit in the chairs, like letting go and just doing your best and like and connecting with the folks who are left. If you're ever with like a really burned out set of healthcare providers, I'd be curious if that helps them like kind of release and like have that absurdity because like that's it actually in
Hmm.
my opinion.
I
I
really
think
like
that's what's
that.
going to get us through,
Yeah.
because people they do just keep leaving, and we hope to replace them, but it's tricky out there.
Oh,
Okay, I think I'm seeing if I had any other. I think those are the main things that I wanted to talk about. Um, are there any other like yeah, anything else you want to say? So for folks who are listening, like some people are learners. Not everyone's a physician who listens, but most folks work in healthcare in some way. What do you want to make sure that they hear from you? You're everyone's teacher right now. We're all in your class. So what is it that you want to make sure that we hear before the end of the lesson today?
ooh, couple of things. First, I think about conversations that I have with students around like using scripts and learning scripts, because one exercise that I also find really fun to do is I ask students, medical learners, and I'll point to them and I say, every time I point to you, I want you to say hi. And so I point, and you have to say it loud and enthusiastically. And so I point and they go, hi. And then I do it again and again and again and again. And the enthusiasm starts to wane
Yeah,
because how could it not?
yeah,
And when we reflect afterwards, people usually say, well, you kept pointing at us and pointing at us a lot. And I mean, I think there's a lot of connection between what you just described in medicine of someone constantly pointing and you've got to say hi as enthusiastically as possible. And a lot of groups say, well, you can't do that. It's to do something that repetitive over and over. It's really challenging. And my response is yes. And actors can do it. And we have to, as performers, you have a script that you have to perform and live trauma sometimes every single night after night after night after night. And so how do you create protections for yourself as a performer or as an actor or as a role. If you're thinking about medicine as a role, in that role, how do you find a way to protect yourself that in that role, if you're someone who has a specialty or has a career where you've got to deliver bad news a lot of the time or engage in really challenging conversations with patients, how do you find ways to take on that performer mindset where you have to do it night after night, but you take off the costume and you leave that with you. So that's kind of one thing that I'm thinking about. And then just a lot of what we've already talked about. I always like to end a session by highlighting, let the 3 rules of improv or the 4 rules of improv guide you. Don't worry about being funny, clever, witty, or smart. Take care and support each other. There are no mistakes, only gifts, and yes, and each other. And, if you embrace those 4, that can hopefully create a lot of really positive culture shifts, culture changes. And I believe I learned this from Stephen Colbert, the comedian, who talked about how when he did improv, one of the really core tenets of being an improviser on a stage with other improvisers is that your one job is to make everyone else look good. And for me, that's the kind of cultural space that I want to live in, where I'm trying to make everyone else look good and knowing in turn that they're trying to make me look good and look everyone else look good. That's a fun place to play in.
I love that so much. Yeah, actually, when you said the thing, first of all, I wanted to name out loud how helpful it is actually to think of our jobs as roles. And like not like you said at the beginning, as we're performing and pretending, it can still be us. But I actually first heard it from an embodiment coach saying like, so when you're in the room putting on the role of playing the role of doctor temporarily, and that patient is temporarily playing the role of patient, because I think one of the things that's very tricky is that us in healthcare in particular have really taken it on as a core identity. And that
Yes.
means it's really hard to take off. And I don't actually think it's necessary. I know it's like kind of praise and like, wow, and you're the doctor and da da da. But like I think we'll be okay. I think actually we might be a little more okay if we know it's something we can wear and then take off. So I just thank you so much for validating that that makes sense. That's the only way you can do it. And then I wanted to just give a shout out to an actor that I saw do that exact skill set, which was I went and saw Hamilton in Toronto, and almost like 2/3 of the way through the first act, I guess Aaron Burr either was injured or sick or something, but like they paused the show, and maybe like 5 minutes later, they're like, this person is now playing the role of Aaron Burr. And that guy had just been on being like, what's his name? Philip Schuyler, like one of the like the dad of the Schuyler sisters. And like suddenly he was just Aaron Burr. And so just like speaking of role switching, I just was watching him the rest of the time and
Yeah.
probably amplifying, like he seemed great, but I was just like, he didn't even know he was going to do this today. He didn't even know he was going to do
Yeah.
this 5 minutes ago. And suddenly he was doing it. So the practice and preparation that allows him to do that and to leave behind what he thought that night was going to be and be able to pivot.
Yeah.
Come
I mean,
on.
it makes me think about Penguin. Like he got
Yes.
thrown into that chair and then he had to tag in someone else to play his role. And
Yes.
then it continued. Even though that wasn't the headspace they went into it. Yeah, that's a really cool, like you said, the way he was able to kind of completely switch. And
Yes.
that's not how we saw his night going. And
No.
suddenly he has to embody it and live the Aaron
Yeah.
Burr role as if he's been playing it the whole production.
Yeah. And I mean, that's actually the main character of that show. Like Hamilton is too, but like that's one of the 2 lead
It's Aaron,
roles. So
it's an Aaron Burr, yeah.
he's marrying the whole thing. So that, I mean, that also then reminded me the 3 words I wanted to name that you'd said, like, can we create spaces for creativity, spontaneity, and ambiguity? And I think that last one scares us so much that then that means we don't have space for the first 2, but like all 3 go together. And I think the only way we're getting out of this is if we really rely on our creativity because things are challenging, right? And so that means embracing that ambiguity at the same
Absolutely.
time.
And to go back to the conversation about education is that's not how we're trained typically in not just medicine, but just high school,
Yes.
undergrad, and then you get into medicine or any healthcare professional role that you're in. And there's no course on how to like dealing with ambiguity and uncertainty. The whole
Yeah.
profession is about certainty, running a test and knowing the answer.
Yeah.
And there's a huge contradiction there, a
Yeah,
tension.
there's a tension. And I don't think there has to be, I believe, but we're working on
Yeah,
it.
absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been so rich and I really enjoyed talking with you.
Likewise, thank
If
you.
folks like, I don't know, they're having a retreat, they want you for a workshop or whatever, if they just want to check you out, where's some places they can find you on the internet?
They can find me. I always like to say, my name is Hartley. I work at McMaster. If you Google Hartley and McMaster, you'll find my contact information pretty easily.
I love it.
My last name, Jafine, at mcmaster.ca is my email. I'm also on a lot of social media spaces. So if you look up Hartley Jafine, you'll be able to track me down. And I'd welcome an opportunity to chat more about theater and healthcare and medicine. I love talking about this stuff. So thank you so much for having me and for your questions.
You're very welcome. All right. And for everyone listening, I'll talk to you next week.